have from San Antonio area office, the public housing director, David Pohler, who's going to be talking to us about repositioning, a new concept that HUD is trying to get housing authorities to look at. We're going to have our vice chair showing up in a few minutes, and we're doing this recording so that the other commissioners who can't make it can have the ability to know what you're going to share with us, Mr. Pohler. So when you're ready, you can start.
And while this was originally posted as an open meeting under Texas Open Meetings Act, we're not going to have a quorum, right?
Correct.
So we'll continue with an informal conversation, but this is not an open meeting. So we have a little more opportunity to be interactive and answer questions without concern about deliberating outside open
Correct.
meeting.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that.
So I want to talk to you today. HUD's when we talk about asset repositioning, HUD's got a goal to reposition 125,000 public housing units over the next 2 years. And so why do we need to reposition? And here's what it comes down to. So around the country, and these numbers are a little dated, I'll tell you that right now. There's about an estimated $30 billion backlog in public housing modernization needs. So the funding that it takes to continue operating public housing has lagged behind the need for the improvements to the units. And that estimated backlog increases by about 1.5 billion per year. So that the gap is widening. As it stands now, the money we give the Housing Authority for public housing can be spent for public housing only. We provide operating funds to cover the difference between the cost, what the tenants pay in rent, and what it costs to operate the units based on a formula. And we provide capital funds that are intended to help cover the capital needs over the years. These capital funds is where we see most industry experts, including HUD, believe that the amount of funds that have been allocated appropriated through Congress over the years have lagged behind the need to keep the units in condition. So the concern is that, if this continues, we could permanently lose public housing and affordable housing. Right now, with public housing, we have a declaration of trust with the House Authority that restricts what you can do with the units and what you can do with the money. And so if you want to go out and borrow money to improve the units, there's some procedures you can go through and do that. It's pretty involved, but you're restricted. You're not like a private landlord where you can just go pledge your property as collateral for a loan. So through repositioning, some of that would change. It would free up your ability to access private capital. So we'll talk about that in some more detail. So for, I guess 4 or 5 years now, about 4 or 5 years ago, HUD came out with the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program. And this is a program that allowed housing authorities to basically change the funding stream that you use to operate public housing, where you take whatever you were getting in public housing funds through tenant rents, capital funds, and operating funds per year, and we convert that to a different funding stream where it'd be like a Section 8 model, much like the rural housing, where you would collect rent from the tenants, and then you would receive a HAP payment, a housing assistance payments, for the Section 8 part that would be comparable to whatever you were already getting under the public housing program. If you went to RAD, you get a choice between project-based vouchers, where you'd pick another housing authority, since you don't have a voucher program, to administer vouchers where they would pay you HAP payments. They'd inspect the units. They'd make sure that you're living up to your responsibilities as a landlord. And then if you are, you would receive a HAP payment from that housing authority each month, in addition to the rent you collect from tenants. You can select that model under RAD, or you can go project-based rental assistance, which is through HUD's Office of Multifamily, very similar to your rural housing property, where you receive the HAP payments directly from HUD. You'd still be subject to a REAC inspection, and Southwest Housing would oversee the operation. So this would align kind of the way the program operates much more closely with what you experience in rural housing, how the funds flow to you, and what your responsibilities are in maintaining units to receive those funds.
Mr. Pohler,
Yeah.
may the commissioners ask you questions as you're speaking? And you
Yeah, absolutely. Let's keep it, since we're not in an open meeting particularly, let's conversational and interactive is preferable. I'm trying to present, since you're recording it, it's kind of trying to keep it in a presentation format so people can follow, but I think an interactive conversation is preferable. So yeah, just jump right in, and we can jump around and then kind of come back and recap some things at the end.
And for your information, this is our Vice Chair, Michelle Lopez.
Hello.
Hi, how you doing, Ms. Lopez?
David Pohler.
So this presentation is actually, the repositioning presentation is a much longer presentation. I've condensed it because some of the repositioning options that would be available to larger housing authorities, you really don't have to worry about, because your choice is going to be fairly simple. You can choose to do RAD, or you can choose to do Section 18. Those would be the two best, simplest choices for you. And there's some pros and cons to each, and we'll talk about that. So again, if you go RAD, you're going to take whatever you were getting in prior funds through public housing, and you're going to receive those as a landlord. But like a normal landlord, now you're receiving rent. In exchange for that rent, you have to maintain the units, ensure that the tenants are taken care of, but largely just be a landlord. Some of the many of the requirements you have to do for public housing right now, those go away. So it would simplify the administration of the program, and you'd still get the same money you were getting. And the other thing is, it also would allow for some predictability of funding. So if you went to RAD, you would start at whatever that rent has been, and each year you'd be eligible for an OCAF, much like with the rural housing, where your rents would go up a little bit. But it's predictable. So right now in the public housing, we don't know what you're going to get next year in funds, right? It's subject to congressional appropriations every year. It could be more than you got last year. It could be less. In RAD, like the rural housing program, you generally get a cost of living increase each year, but it's never less. So there's some stability and predictability with that option that don't exist with the public housing program. So the other option you could consider is a Section 18 disposition. And Section 18 is a simplified process by which a housing authority can elect to dispose of or demolish units. In this case, we're talking about Section 18 disposition. So under Section 18, you can sell the units outright at market value and use the money for a variety of eligible activities and just completely get out of the business if you chose to, not rebuild public housing. Or you could rebuild public housing or reacquire units elsewhere, assuming you could come up with the capital to do so. Or what's changed recently under Section 18 is now there's a new notice out, the 2018-04, where that says you can project-based vouchers to yourself. You can project-based vouchers in former public housing units through a streamlined process. And so you could technically, if you did a Section 18 disposition to a nonprofit, do you currently have a nonprofit affiliate?
No.
So you could form one, or you could elect to dispose of it to an outside entity. HUD, if you're going to sell it for market value, if you're going to sell it outright to the highest bidder, then you got to sell it for market value based on appraisal. If HUD does allow you to sell the units for less than market value if they're going to continue to be used for affordable housing. So this will require that a LURA be placed on the property to ensure that it continues to be used for affordable housing purposes. So technically, to simplify this, you you could dispose of the units to your nonprofit affiliate or another San Marcos Housing or nonprofit affiliate, and then they would operate the units like a Section 8 landlord, where much like the RAD, they would collect tenant rents, and the nonprofit would then maintain the units, and you'd get a HAP payment, a housing assistance payments, like you do with the rural housing. Where Section 18, so it's very similar to RAD, under Section 18 disposition. Where it's different is the rent you would get under Section 18 disposition, under project-based vouchers, is whatever those units are worth on the open market. So RAD, you would start getting whatever you were getting previously under public housing. Under Section 18, you could charge what the units are worth. So just for conversation's sake, your two-bedroom units in the, you know, with a little bit of improvement, what does a two-bedroom unit rent for in Kyle? That's similar to the condition and location of your two-bedroom units.
They were renting.
About I think it's 500 something right now.
Well, not what you're getting now, but if you went and rented, if you went out today and want to rent a unit similar to that, what would you pay? What would you be willing to pay?
They were renting something across the street a few years ago for around between $700 and $800 for a two-bedroom.
Okay. So that's probably a little higher than you're getting under public housing. So if it's comparable, so the advantage to Section 18 is like a private landlord that has. Are you guys familiar with how the Section 8 program works in general? Like in a tenant-based Section 8?
You might want to explain.
Okay. So in tenant-based Section 8, a housing authority that administers vouchers gives family vouchers, say, go find the unit of your choice. When they find it, the landlord says, I would like $1,000 for this unit. And the housing authority says, well, we're gonna look and make sure 1,000 is reasonable, because we're not gonna participate in paying 1,000 if that unit's only worth at 900. We're not gonna pay you more than a reasonable, an educated renter would pay you. So basically the market value is what's allowed for those units. So under Section 18, if you did that and your nonprofit were to improve the units, as those units are improved, as the market in Kyle changes, and I assume rents are going up quite a bit, you can, like any landlord, you can come at the end of a year and say, hey, when we renew the lease next year, I want more rent. And then the housing authorities that's administering the vouchers would say, well, what are you asking for? Is that reasonable? So the rent increases under Section 18 would be limited by what the market will bear. Under RAD, the rent increases are limited to whatever the published OCAF is. So under Section 18, if you did project-based vouchers, if the market dropped dramatically, don't anticipate that happening, but if it were, then the housing authority administering the vouchers would be required to say, well, I know you want 1,000, but you know, rents have dropped in the area, those units are only worth 800, whatever that would be. So whether you choose RAD or Section 18, if those are the routes you went, you'd go to like a Section 8 model, where you're, instead of operating public housing, now you're receiving a Section 8 HAP payment, either through HUD's Office of Multifamily or from another housing authority.
Mr. Pohler, would you let us know what OCAF stands for?
Oh, it's basically an annual adjustment factor. It's an annual, it's like a 1 or 2% increase to your rents. It's a something cost adjustment factor.
Yeah, I can't remember.
It's a federally published amount that they said, here's what you're going to be eligible for an increase. And again, that provides predictability you don't have now. Now we don't know what you're going to get in operating and capital funds next year. You know, there's been some proposals in the past couple of years to give 0 capital funds. Now that hasn't happened, but it's always subject to congressional appropriations. So it's difficult to do long-term planning when you really don't know what money you're going to have next year or the year after. If you move to a Section 8 model, where you receive funds based on what the units are worth, or based on what you were receiving subject to no cap. Now you say, well, I know more or less what I'm not going to get any less next year than I was getting this year, and likely more. So you can start doing more long-range capital needs planning because you know what kind of money you have to work with. So there's some recent changes in it to kind of, not to get too deep in the weeds and cause a bunch of confusion. I'm going to skip through a few of these slides, but you'll have them, and we can talk about questions as you encounter them. But I want to kind of stay at a high conceptual level first of all. So again, under RAD, here's an example where you see they say the RAD rents, they would take what you were getting in capital, operating, and tenant rent, and that would establish your new Section 8 rent, the starting point. What was changed, and this is a little bit dated slide, but in 2018, so in 2018 we had a higher capital fund allocation than the prior years. And so folks who had signed up for RAD said, well, I'd like, because whatever you were getting, that established your initial rent. And they're like, well, you know what? I'm going to withdraw from my RAD application. Now I want to reapply because I want the higher capital fund. So what HUD allowed said, no, you don't have to do that. We'll give you the 2018 capital funds, even if you had applied prior. So that's what this slide is telling. It's really not something you have to get too concerned about. So Kyle, here, this is, and I know you don't have all these bedroom sizes, but this is basically if you were to go to RAD in 2019, these are the rent amounts per unit you would be eligible for. So, and that includes a utility allowance. So whatever you're paying the tenant utility allowance, it's reduced a little bit. So this is RAD. If you were to go Section 18 and you did project-based vouchers, you wouldn't be limited to these amounts. You'd be limited to what are the units worth on the open market. So this is really the decision point. If you say, yes, we want to reposition, and there's other advantages we haven't talked about we're going to get to. We want to reposition, and should we go RAD or should we go Section 18? In my mind, it comes down to, well, which is more financially lucrative, right? If you're a landlord, do you want, will I take 610 for a 2-bedroom? Or is the market such that if I improve these units a little bit more, maybe I could get 700 or whatever they're worth? Earlier we said that the units similar to these are going for what for a 2-bedroom?
Between 7 and 8.
Between 7 and 8.
Across the
So
street.
again, let's assume your units are real similar to those. So your question would be, do I want 610 for a 2-bedroom under RAD, or do I want 700 under Section 18? It sounds like Section 18 would be more financially favorable to you.
So may I just ask a couple of questions? So if we were to do the Section 18, the capital funds then could be used to do the improvements so that we could bring them up to par, so that there would be an opportunity to look at the potential for market value or market price for the rent on those.
Yeah,
correct?
so it's a good question because there's some differences in RAD and Section 18, and here's the big one. So if you go RAD, you say, we're going to take, when we convert to RAD, on the 30th, we're public housing, on the 1st, they're RAD, and all the funds, you'd set up your RAD transaction where all the reserves, the operating reserves and the capital fund reserves, those funds go with the conversion. They're now property of the nonprofit, or the housing authority is now managing those funds under a RAD program. If you go Section 18, where it's an actual disposition, those funds can't cross over with the property. So what you want to do is make sure that, so you could apply for Section 18 and get approved, and then you have some time to say, when you actually say, okay, we're signing the papers today, and tomorrow this will be a privately held property under the nonprofit. So what you'd want to do is make sure that all your reserves and your capital funds are put into the units in some form because the cash doesn't get to go across with the transfer. Other assets like an administration building, vehicles, equipment, you can ask for permission to transfer those with the property, but you can't take the cash. So you'd plan it, you just,
Right.
let's put the money into the units, and the tricky part is you would, then on day one, on the first, you've technically got no cash in the bank until you collect rent and your HAP payment.
Okay.
But if you'd own these units, you'd own the units free and clear, as a private landlord, could you go to the bank and say, hey, look, I own these units free and clear. I've got a HAP contract that says I'm gonna get this much, I've pretty much got a guaranteed income stream. Can we negotiate a small line of credit to help me operate until I get some reserves built up? I think it'd be a pretty easy thing to do, because again, you'd have no debt on the units initially, and that, you know, you could go borrow funds to improve the units. You can not only just do a line of credit, you could say, now as I'm getting ready to convert, I've already structured a deal with a local bank, or we're gonna do a bond issuance. It's probably not, 21 units is not enough to make a bond issuance make sense, but you know, you can do tax credits, you can do all the things that a private owner, you could pursue those other sources of capital to improve the units.
That's
And
Section 18? or
Under
is it
Section
right?
18, well, under both RAD and Section 18, you can pursue that.
Okay.
But the difference with Section 18 is, as you improve the units, now you have a chance to say, well, now the units are in better shape, I want more rent. Just like a private landlord, you say, look, if I'm gonna put new cabinets in there and countertops and the things that a renter would want to pay for, now you say, as I improve those units, I want to get more rent for the units. You would be able to do that same thing, because again, you're operating like a private landlord. Your HAP contract, housing payments contract, would say, look, as long as you take care of the units and they pass inspection, and you follow the lease and you don't commit other fraud or malfeasance, we're going to continue to pay you HAP payments. So
Then
the
just
other,
a
go ahead.
quick follow-up. Once, if we were choosing this option to go Section 18, become the private landlord, and do improvements, if we could, is there a maximum amount of time that we have to actually sign the papers to move us from where we are over to the Section 18?
Great question. So if you were to apply for disposition and get approved, there's currently no time frame within which you have to say, you have to complete the transaction.
Okay.
That could come in the future, but there's currently not. In fact, you could get approved and then 2 years later say, you know, we thought this was going to work. It doesn't look like it's going to. We've changed our mind, and opt out of it.
Okay.
If you were to go the RAD option, there is a clock that's set, that once you get approved for RAD, you have a certain amount of time to develop a financing plan and complete the transaction. And if you don't, then you'd be in, you know, they'd cancel your RAD application. It wouldn't prohibit you from reapplying for RAD in the future, should you be able to figure out how to make it work. So you could get approved for disposition, and then you decide when you're ready to dispose, when you've got all your ducks in a row.
Okay. Thank you.
So this is new to all housing. There's just repositioning options, and why I'm focusing just on RAD and Section 18 is because small housing authorities, those with less than 50 units, you have ability to do this without a lot of questions, right? It's a streamlined process for you. For other housing authorities that want to do a Section 18 disposition, if they have 51 units, they can only dispose of those units if they're obsolete. The cost of getting them back into condition exceeds 60-something% of the total development cost of new units. And so most housing authorities don't have the option to say, I want to do a Section 18 disposition to myself and start charging market rents. If they did, a lot of PHAs would want to do that. This option is specifically for PHAs under 50 units, and part of that is because not only is it difficult for you guys with less than 50 units to make this economy of scale work, and to do all the things you have to do to comply with public housing regulations. But it's challenging for HUD to oversee all these small housing authorities that often struggle with challenges. So the latitude for PHAs under 50 units, you can do things with a lot less red tape now than you might have had faced in the past. And so this is new. This is new in 2018. If you choose to do the disposition under 50, you'd have to say, look, we're getting out of the public housing business and we're done. That declaration of trust, that ACC, that's gone. Once you sign the papers and you transition, there's no way to come back later and say, I want to build new public housing, absent some new funding from HUD where they say you can compete for funds to start a housing authority. And that hasn't happened in quite a few years. You can also, in conjunction with this or separate from this, you can reposition through other methods, including transferring your assets to another housing authority to let them operate it. You can do consortium. Texas law doesn't really allow for consolidation of housing authorities, but there's some different options there that you can do. Some small housing authorities have determined, it's really, we lack the economy of scale to make this work. And so they've transferred their units and their real estate to a neighboring housing authority who will just operate those units like their own. And so your board would not, Texas law doesn't really allow to dissolve a housing authority, but you'd have a housing authority with no assets. So if you did Section 18, you can dispose of it to your own nonprofit, should you form one. You could dispose it to a nonprofit of a neighboring housing authority. You would have to find a neighboring housing authority to oversee the Section 8 vouchers. So you'd have a chance to pick, here's who I want to be on the other end of that HAP contract. Now, I'm going to be the landlord, the property owner, and on the other end of that housing assistance payments contract is going to be a housing authority that says, we agree to pay you these funds as long as you honor all the provisions of the contract. They would inspect your units and so forth. If you go RAD and you go the project-based rental assistance, then you're still subject to a REAC inspection. You would be required to transmit your financial statements to HUD, and you'd be subject to Southwest Housing oversight, periodic reviews, the same kind of things HUD does now in a little different form. If you go project-based vouchers under either RAD or through Section 18, now your relationship is no longer directly with HUD. It would be with whoever's administering the vouchers. So, like any private property owner that has a contract with, under vouchers, they're required to maintain the units and take care of them and follow the contract. But you don't have to submit your financial statements to HUD. You don't have a HUD review. What happens under either project-based vouchers or tenant-based vouchers, if the housing authority administering those vouchers comes out and inspects the units and they say, look, your unit failed inspection, you've got to correct these 5 items. And if you don't correct those items, they say, now we're going to start withholding checks. We're not going to pay you because you're not maintaining the units. And if it continues, it could get to the point where they cancel they terminate that contract, and now there's no more HAP payment. So that's the difference in management, and it's significant because right now, in fact, I think I have a slide. Let's see. I'm going to jump ahead here just a bit.
Do we do vouchers? We don't do them at all, right? Okay.
Well, I am missing the slide I was looking for. I tried to cut this down because it wasn't letting me email it, and I hope I didn't delete this slide. Well, I'm missing the slide I was looking for. But essentially, so now when you receive under your ACC with HUD, with public housing, we say, look, you're highly restricted how you can spend those funds. You've got to do a lot of things administratively. You've got to do the same things with your 21 units that the San Antonio Housing Authority does with 6,000 units. You've got to transmit your financial statements. Your funds are put into e-locks. You've got to get locks access to access your funds. There's a process to go through. There's a substantial, hang on just a second.
That'd be a load off my back.
Yeah, I mean, but these are probably the ones that are in the best shape though. Like, if we had this option for the other dressing, yes. I think it would be hands down, though. I don't know that we would have a question about what to do.
I told him that.
Okay, so-
You may ask him.
Substantial reduction. So if all the things you have to do as a public housing agency operating the public housing program, that stuff goes away, and now you get to be more of a private landlord, right? Just manage property. So the hope is that not only would you potentially get more rent under Section 18, project-based vouchers, but the stuff you have to do to earn that money would be just, manage units, enforce the lease, make sure you take care of the tenants. The work you do now for public housing, that would be a substantial reduction in that. So if you guess, Mr. Arredondo, of your day, how much is spent just being a landlord, and how much is spent doing the other stuff that you have to do?
The other stuff.
It's mostly the other stuff, right? And so this would change that dynamic.
Okay. So I guess one of my questions, I think our biggest concern is our other property that truly, I don't know that we would have any, I don't know how much money it would take for us to really bring those up. I mean, our best units are the ones that we're talking about right now as an option for them. But do you know what other housing authorities are this small and what they might be doing, or something? Have an idea
So
of what
let's.
they're thinking of?
So I'll say I took a look at. I've been out for 2 weeks, so I quickly looked at your financial statements last night, and I see that you're currently allocating your costs about 50-50 between public housing and rural housing. Even though 21 of the units are public housing and 31 are rural housing.
Right.
So that allocation probably is not proper. Now, if you say, hey, rural housing is easier to manage and we spend less time on that, and we can document that, so your allocation has to be on some reasonable basis. If you're saying, oh yeah, rural housing is a lot easier to manage, so even though it's 31 units, and we have timesheets how we track this, so I know Mr. Arredondo's time is really spent 50-50, then that's okay. If you're just allocating cost
Right.
because rural housing doesn't have the money to pay its bills, that's a violation of our ACC.
Right.
Again, an ACC that would go away if you go to either RAD. So the other big advantage through RAD, and I'm going to circle back to rural housing, through RAD or Section 18 disposition, is the funds you receive are defederalized. How you spend those funds is your business, like it would be for any other private landlord. So right now, we say, look, you can't use our funds to subsidize rural housing. If you wanted to do that, 10% battery remaining.
On the
Is
unit
there a charger?
So if you wanted to, let's say you're turning a profit under Section 18, under project-based vouchers, and you want to use that profit to subsidize rural housing, your business. Now, I do know, and I want to be careful in talking about rural housing program. So
Right.
you have a 9% note right now, right?
I think so, yes.
You can renegotiate those notes. Now, rural housing may be reticent to do so, but I've seen other housing authorities that have been successful in renegotiating that interest rate to get significant reductions. Because you say, look, it's just not cash flow, and we can't make it work. If you were to give the program, tell rural housing, look, I just can't make it work. Here's the keys. We're going to have to we can't make it on this 9% note, ultimately they would find another administrator to come in and manage the property, and they'd likely have to renegotiate that note to make it work. So you could negotiate that. It's not an easy thing to do.
Right.
Alfredo Castaneda in Carrizo Springs has done it. You could talk with him to see how he went about it. But I know, I can see now on your financials, so you've lost money, significant money. You've operated at a deficit in rural housing for 2 years. You've operated at a reasonable profit in public housing, but what you've done is your capital funds we're giving you. As a small housing authority, you can choose how to spend those capital funds. You're spending the bulk of the capital funds on just ongoing operational
Yes.
costs and not improving the units. So you just received a physically substandard score because the unit, and now I don't know, I didn't look at all the details, that could be a lack of modernization. It could be just not well prepared for the inspections. So things like if there's vegetation, limbs rubbing on the roof, big deductions. If there's a sidewalk raised up more than an inch, or it's a trip hazard, big. So some of those big deductions don't mean that the units are not. The REAC inspection is not an inspection of what kind of quality of construction, do the units have a useful life. It's more a health and safety oriented
Okay.
inspection.
Okay.
So it's not the same as a physical needs assessment where an expert would tell you, look, these things need about $30,000 a unit. They're going to need roofs in 3 years.
Okay.
The REAC inspection is is the roof leaking? Not does it have a 5-year useful life
Are there
left?
current safe conditions for?
So there's a little different, but it does tell you that you've got some issues physically.
Yes.
And I think you can look at the units and you can see that those I just drove by this morning, those air conditioners can't have much life left in them. You know, you have needs, so that's something you'd
Yeah,
want
I
to think
think-
about.
and
But
that's
but
definitely-
long term, using your capital funds, so first of all, let me back up, and if you want to stay in the public housing program, you can I'm not saying you need to do these things. It's your choice as a board. But if you're going to stay in the public housing program, particularly now that you're substandard physical, your ability to spend 100% of your capital funds on operations, that's gone.
Right.
HUD's going to say, now you need to put that money into the units. And so now it further constrains your cash flow and your ability to indirectly subsidize rural housing. That's got to end. So if you stay in the public housing program, you've got to get back to a reasonable allocation, 50-50, unless you can provide some backup of how you came up with that. You can't come up with your allocation based on what the program can afford. It's not allowed. So I don't know, and I'm not doing a review here, we're not going to get into detail, but on the surface, your allocation doesn't look legitimate. And this is an issue we came up across to much more severe extent some years ago, if you remember.
Yes, and I think that's exactly why we really wanted to have the workshop, because we recognize that it is not sustainable the way it is working right now, and that we truly do. We have told ourselves as a board we need to make a decision very soon so that we can determine, is this even viable? What are the options? How do we move forward? We don't want to reduce those opportunities for people to have housing that's affordable here, but if their conditions of these units are not even something that we want to rent out, and we don't have the capital, we're not able to keep up with it, then that's been a real big concern for us.
Right. So you've got I agree with your thought process there. You want to start doing some long-term planning. Is this, and the slides I went through at the beginning where HUD recognizes nationally
Right.
our inventory is at risk because of the capital needs backlog. In your case, your public housing is healthier financially than rural housing. But even that, could those units use some significant injection of funds? They could, right?
Yes.
And so long-term, particularly if we get a future allocation of capital fund, big reductions in future capital funds, it could get more challenging. So not trying to scare anybody or speculate, because I don't know what Congress is going to do.
Right.
You know, none of us do. But the likelihood that we'll continue to see increases with the current state of the economy and the federal budget,
Right.
you know, you can speculate. Do you think that's going to happen? Do you think it's more likely to get decreases or flat funding in the future, or increases? I mean,
Yeah,
it's a risk, right? You're a business. You're trying to minimize your risk and ensure financial viability, and so you want to look at the different tracks available to say which one is the best to achieve those things, to be able to take care of the units, to ensure that they're here for future generations, that they're in good condition. You've got some options to figure out which is the best for you to achieve that.
And there was one follow-up. So you mentioned, maybe a couple slides ago, if we were to choose that we wanted to be out of the business, sell them, whatever it was, and just not have these units any longer, is there, and you said something about we could not ever return to public housing. It probably wouldn't happen for the city. Is that what I understood?
Yeah, so let me clarify that. So normally under Section 18, when you dispose of units, let's say I have 500 units and I dispose of 100 of them. The current regulations, a housing authority can come back and say, now I want to rebuild 100 or acquire 100 because HUD has an agreement that pay me up to 500 units, so I want to replace the ones that I disposed of. If you opt for this under 50 option, where we're letting you do it with much less justification, that option, once you dispose of it, you can't, those 50, you don't have a right to replace those, right? There's that right to replace those units that would exist for other housing authorities, that doesn't exist if you do if you're taking that under 50 exception. Now, if a housing authority, if you decide to say, we're going to sell these units to the highest bidder, and we're going to get completely out of the business, what HUD would do is we'd find a neighboring housing authority that has a voucher program and say, will you issue vouchers? Will you be willing to accept 21 additional vouchers? You issue vouchers to these families. They can now go rent the privately owned unit of their choice here in Kyle or elsewhere. They could choose where they want to live. They could go to Los Angeles, New York, whatever. The voucher travels with them, and you'd be out of the business. And the families that were there, they would get vouchers to go choose a unit of their choice, but there'd be no more public housing here. So it's an option that exists for you if you chose to go that route, or if you choose to do the Section 18 disposition, where now you say, I want to become a landlord, and the families can rent from me as a voucher participant under project-based vouchers.
David, let me ask this question.
Yeah.
If we go that route, to go to vouchers, to our current residents, when that resident passes away or changes or is not eligible for a voucher anymore, can the administering agency, say San Marcos, then choose to replace that with someone that's not from Kyle? Because we're interested in the Kyle residents being considered for housing. So once we go that route, do we have any assurances that Kyle residents would have access to those vouchers?
So there's a couple of different ways for the entity that manages the voucher program. If they're going to do project-based vouchers, so what would happen? Let's say it's San Marcos. They're now committing 21 project-based vouchers under a HAP contract with you. They have to administer a waiting list for those 21 project-based vouchers. And there's some latitude about how that waiting list is administered. Is it administered at the site that has the vouchers? Or does it just the next person on the overall waiting list have a choice of a project-based or tenant-based voucher? So there'd be some latitude about how you do that. Can you do a residency preference, I think is what you're talking about?
Well, we want to, I'm sure, I'm not speaking for the board, but if I were them, I would want to be certain that our people here in Kyle would have access to those vouchers.
So you can't restrict, under the current program, right, under public housing, you can't say, look, you must live in Kyle to apply for public housing.
True.
So you already don't have that. Now, you can have a preference for residents where they might move ahead on the waiting list, so you kind of achieve that outcome. I'm not certain if a residency preference in conjunction with project-based vouchers is allowed. The other thing that's different with project-based vouchers, by the way, for residents. So residents would go from paying what they were paying in public housing, that's similar, they paid the same amount basically now as a Section 8 resident. But they get some mobility options which are big time difference for them. So at the end of a year in your project-based unit, they could say, you know, enjoyed it, now I'd like my regular voucher and go rent the unit of my choice in Kyle, San Marcos, New York, wherever. And what the San Marcos Housing Authority then would have to do is say, okay, as soon as I have a voucher available, you're going to get it, but I can't issue you that voucher until I'm ready to fill the unit you're leaving. Because I have a project-based voucher agreement with Kyle, it's nonprofit, that says I got to keep those units filled. So San Marcos would have to assign another tenant to the unit. Could San Marcos have a waiting list? So housing authorities that administer vouchers is really going to be whoever's managing the vouchers decides this. Could you influence it? You could. But they can either say we have a project-based waiting list that's separate from our Section 8 tenant-based waiting list, or it's one and the same. And I go to the person at the top of the list and say, right now I have a project-based unit. Do you want that unit, or do you want to wait on a regular voucher? And if you say I'll wait, then you go to the next and the next. Most housing authorities would opt to do a project-based voucher waiting list. So whoever was willing to live in that unit in Kyle could be on that waiting list. And then after a year in that unit, they could take a voucher and leave. So it is appealing. It does create some demand for the units because I assume San Marcos's waiting list is more than a year now, right? So if I was willing to live in Kyle in the project-based unit for a year, now I get a regular voucher and I can go wherever I want to go.
So we'd lose a voucher here.
No, you wouldn't. They wouldn't give that voucher to the family to move because they'd give them one of their regular vouchers and then they'd refill the project-based voucher unit. So those 21 project-based voucher units that are under a HAP contract, you keep getting
people there.
those filled and keep getting paid as long as you keep those units in good repair and so forth.
So project-based is really site-based.
It's tied to the
And-
property.
Right, and then
Tenant-based is
where
tied
you
to the
can go
tenant.
wherever, and
So
they
at the
just
end of a
take
year, they could say, I'm going to trade my project-based voucher for a tenant-based voucher. But the project-based voucher will be refilled.
it. Okay, okay.
So that mobility option is a great deal for tenants, right? So now if you're in Kyle Public Housing and you get a job offer, you have to give up housing assistance to go take that if it's outside of Kyle, right? Or my mother who lives in, Brownsville is ill and I need to go take care of her. You'd give up your housing assistance to do that. If you under this mobility option that's allowed with project-based vouchers, at the end of that year, I can say, well, now I can go take care of mom and can take the assistance with me under tenant-based program. So it's a big advantage for tenants. So if you were to talk, and you'd have to, if you're going to do this, talk about this with your tenants about here's what we're proposing to do. You'd have to revise your PHA plan to explain this, put it, allow public comment, just like any other big changes you're going to do. You're supposed to have a public comment period where people can come to the board and say, I don't think you should replace the roofs. I think you should replace the air conditioners. All those other decisions you make, people have a chance to comment on that. The same exists here if you say we're going to dispose of the units or we're going to do RAD. You have to put it out for public comment, revise your plan, and let people weigh in on it, including your tenants. So, but it's pretty easy sell to tenants if they understand it. There's a lot of initial fear that we're going to lose the public housing, we're going to lose our assistance, but it's not actually accurate. It would change the assistance they're receiving and open up a lot more opportunities to residents, and their cost of renting the units would not, actually it would change a little bit. So under public housing, you're not allowed to give an air conditioning utility allowance to tenants. You're not supposed to. So basically, when they run those air conditioners, it's at their own cost. Under Section 8, you must give an air conditioning utility allowance to tenants. So for a tenant, let's say I was 30% of my income was $300. I have $1,000 income, $300. The way it works now is in public housing, you'd say, okay, you're getting a $50 utility allowance, so pay me $250 out of your 300 share and keep 50 to pay your utilities, which are likely much more than 50 if you run an air conditioner. Under Section 8, that same tenant, the day we convert, on the 30th for public housing, on the 1st, we'll say, well, now you're a Section 8 tenant, so you get an air conditioning utility allowance. So your utility allowance just went from 50 to 125 a month or 150, whatever it is. So pay me, it'll say it goes to 150. Now pay me $150, keep 150 to pay your utilities. So for a tenant, overnight, it could be much more financially attractive to the tenant because they're going to get an air conditioning utility allowance if the unit has air conditioning.
Okay.
I really deleted some slides I shouldn't have here, so I know this is getting a little disjointed. Sorry about that. Not expecting anybody to like completely digest this here today. We're just, the goal here is to get you curious, to want to know more, to think about this. We can get into the details. HUD's got a couple of things available. One is we can set up a panel call where we'd have somebody from the Section 8, the Special Application Center, the folks who handle the disposition applications. We could have a RAD expert. We could have, they have 5 people on the calls that bring various expertise, and it allows you as a housing authority to say, well, we're thinking about doing this, but what about this?
Okay.
What about this? The pros and cons, it allows you to kind of, after you've done a little thinking about this and studying, to hear from some experts outside of our office, to get some feedback. Well, if you did this, here's what happened. If you did this one, it's a little different. We're also in the process, and hopefully we're just a couple of weeks away, of awarding a technical assistance contract where you could have access to basically a consultant who you say, well, now we think we want to do this, but I want somebody who really knows this stuff to walk me through it so I don't make a mistake that I didn't, because I didn't think of something. And so you'd have access to those panel calls and a technical assistance contractor eventually that's only available to housing authorities, smaller housing authorities, to kind of, because if you have to go out and get your own consultant, I mean, you just don't have money for those things now.
Right.
Exactly.
So those things would be available. We just want you to think about this conceptually and think about what you want to know more about. And we can talk about it on a conference call or different mechanisms. There's lots of stuff out there to read. I'd encourage you to not just seek input from HUD, but I'd want to talk to housing authorities who've done this. Hey,
Right.
do you regret? Would you have done something different? What do you think?
That's one of
So-
my questions too. Do you, like, examples of smaller housing authorities that have done some sort of repositioning and
So
Similar.
it's a little bit the Section 18 stuff. We've had some that have done RAD. The Section 18 is pretty new. We have some that have applied, but have not actually consummated the sale.
okay.
And I got a couple examples I'll just run through at the end here. Excuse me. So Texas Housing Association has a training coming up. They do these, they have a group doing some training where they're doing it without HUD there, so they can talk candidly amongst the membership. I think you're a member of Texas Housing
Yes.
Association, so it's just, I think it's in Austin. And it's a chance for you to hear, well, here's what I like, don't like, to hear where you guys can talk freely without HUD in the room. Does this make sense, not make sense? I've got a couple of,
Mr. Pohler, I've got to add
Yeah.
though that there's a fee. It's not free. to the
I don't
membership.
know. I don't know, because this is a, they charge a fee for like their conferences and some of those
Yes.
things and trainings, but yeah, you'd have to check with Linda Bryant. I don't know if that particular one is just a meeting where there's not a fee or if there is a fee.
I'll
I
check
would
into
suspect there's a fee because they have costs they have to cover in renting a facility and so
Right.
forth. I've got a slide here that talks about if you're ready for demolition disposition, here's the process you need to go through. Forget disposition. If you're ready for, forget demolition. If you're ready for disposition, there's details. I would say let's hold on that. The other thing HUD's got available is we've got a group of folks that have been trained to kind of help you get that transaction done.
Okay.
So if you said, okay, we've decided we want to do this, where do we start? Then we connect you with somebody, say, okay, well, let's talk about each of these things, and in more detail, here's all the steps you need to do. They'd be there available to help you get that completed. So we've got these transaction facilitators that can help you through that. So I'm not going to go a lot into that. There's some sites, some links here. If you want to go look at more information.
Can I just, on the previous slide, very quickly down there, you know, we had share this with mayor and council, because we know that's definitely a public body that we want engaged with this conversation as we're moving forward. It mentions county judge, county board of the commissioners. Is that a requirement as well, since it's a city? It's a city.
Well, I think they said, letter from a mayor in your case, or your municipal housing authority. If you're a county housing authority,
Okay.
the
Okay,
county
just wanted to
judge
make
is the
sure.
appointing. So it mentions so just because
Just
it
in
could be
case.
different.
Yeah, okay.
But more broadly, in addition to those, not only do you have something, you've got to have a letter of support, right? We want the mayor's on board
Right.
with this.
Right. Yes, that's why we are trying to investigate, because we now need to, once we have an idea of what we're thinking, really have that conversation with the
Right.
mayor and council so they understand, here's what we're facing.
And then you'd have to put in your PHA plan, you'd do public comment, you'd tell the residents, you've got to do resident consultation, here's what we're proposing to do, here's what it's going to change for you, here's how it affects you. Yeah, all of that stuff would have to be done. So there's some links there. This one, so Bexar County's got actually only 30 public housing units, and they're going through a disposition proposal. But let me show you what those look like. So they've got single-family homes, and in their case, so single-family homes from a landlord's perspective are much more expensive to operate than like 30 units in one property. And so even though these are really nice homes, they're electing to just sell these on the open market. Now, they may elect to acquire some units later in like a tax credit property. So they can sell these under the scattered site provision where they don't have to agree to get out of the business. So they can elect to acquire other units like in an apartment complex or not, and just manage voucher program and use these sale proceeds for a lot of eligible activities, including supporting their large existing nonprofit inventory. So how you can use sale proceeds is much more broad than how you can use current public housing funds. So, well, it just goes through the different options, which I didn't even talk about with you guys because you don't have to get into that. It's more complex, but for them, it's just, do they want to do project-based vouchers? Do they want to sell them outright? Do they want to do RAD? In their case, the RAD rents they're getting, way less than what those would rent for on the open market. So choosing between Section 18 project-based vouchers and RAD project-based vouchers, no brainer. It's probably double the rent or more under Section 18. But whether they want to do project-based vouchers or just use the proceeds to support their existing nonprofit inventory, because they'd be managing their own vouchers, that was their decision. So here's Elgon Housing Authority, not too far from you guys. They haven't decided to do this, but we put it up as a case study because they're in a market where market rents are gone up quite a bit. They're in a healthy, pretty healthy financial condition, not crazy. Don't have a lot of reserves, only have about 3 months of reserves. Their RAD rent would be $547. So they could go out and, try and get some financing to improve the units. Here's kind of what the units look like. You can see those roofs probably need some love, and
Yes.
but they're brick units. They're not in terrible shape. That's kind of counters. That's not what you typically encounter in a market rental
Right.
Anymore. So could they use some upgrades? They certainly could. But the big difference is they'd go from $547 a month. If those units are cleaned up and improved a little bit, in Elgon, they're probably renting for $1,000, or so. So you could dramatically and when I go to a bank and I say, look, I've been operating these about $547 a month with all these other requirements that I'm not gonna have to do anymore, and I've got potential to get much more rent, you could get financing to improve the units, which allows you to get more rent,
Okay.
et cetera. So Thorndale is a neighboring housing authority near Elgon. Actually, Doris, I think Broad Street, manages both of those. And they're very healthy financially, so, and their units are in much better shape.
Yes.
So they could technically do Section 8 disposition with both of these and either do project-based vouchers in those units or just, you know, sell them for what the market will bear. But it would change dramatically the potential revenue that they have to operate with. So I probably cut some slides out of there that would be helpful. But there's more on the links that are in there where you can get more information.
Okay.
We can talk to you guys again over the phone, you know, to answer any questions. Again, really just want to get you thinking, realizing there's some opportunities here under repositioning that may be more favorable to you. And certainly that rural housing, I get it. You got to figure out something with that, because if you stay in public housing, one, we're not going to let you use your capital funds for operations because of your failing physical score. We're going to ask you to give us a plan to improve the unit. So, and you're going to have to address your cost allocation. You can't just allocate cost based on ability to pay. That's not a valid basis. So you're going to have to convince us that 50-50 is reasonable, or correct that.
Right. We definitely understand that piece of it too, and have been working to try to figure this out, but I think we're really at the point where we need to make some decisions soon so that we figure this out and we correct the things that we have. There was one other question I had for you, and it just escaped me. I don't know, do y'all have any other questions?
David?
No, the only question I was gonna ask is, at this point, because I know that you had mentioned about the voucher following the client wherever they go. Now, if their financial position changes at any time.
The tenant, if the tenant's financial position changes?
Right. If their financial position changes, would they still be eligible for the voucher?
Yeah, so it's similar but different to public housing. So in public housing, as your income goes up, your share of the rent goes up. And then at some point you can elect to say, I want to pay the flat rent, right? No more than the flat rent. So it kind of caps how high your rent goes. But you're not currently forced to move out if you become over income. Under the voucher program, what happens is once you get, so as your income goes up, you keep paying a third of your income towards rent at a minimum. And at some point, if you're paying the full rent and there's no HAP payment, after 6 months of no HAP payment with a tenant-based voucher, they say, well, now, congratulations, you're on your own. You don't, we haven't had to pay for help you in 6 months, so you're graduated, and they'll issue that voucher to another family. There's not a provision, I don't think, in the project-based voucher program. Once the tenant's paying the full rent, they're not required to move, but they just keep paying the full rent. And the housing authority paying the HAP payment, it just reduces their cost.
I remember my question. It had to do with the nonprofits. The Bexar County, Elgon, and Thorndale, do they have nonprofits affiliated with them?
I don't think Elgon and Thorndale do. Bexar County their nonprofit inventory is much larger than their public housing. So they're primarily nonprofit inventory now, private apartment complexes that they manage. Elgon and Thorndale, I don't think they have one, but they'd have to form one. It's not that onerous to do so.
Right, okay. Yeah, because we don't have that. All right, well, it's a lot of information, a lot of good information. It's not as bleak as I think the chair and I met with Frank just to sort of say, let's move forward with what we need to do with the commissioners and trying to schedule a workshop early in the year so that we can have these conversations and really move forward to making some decisions on a plan so that we can start talking with our residents, start talking with mayor and council and the community about what we need to do and what we're facing.
So maybe just a little quick recap, kind of what your options are. So you could stay in the public housing program just like it is. You're going to have to spend your capital funds on capital needs and correct your cost allocation if you choose to do that. You can go to RAD, where you can say, I'm going to take the rent I was getting in public housing, but in the form of a Section 8, like a Section 8 voucher landlord through project-based vouchers. Still operating it as the housing authority now, a landlord under the voucher program. You could do Section 18 disposition, where you say, I want to dispose of these units to a nonprofit affiliate to manage them as project-based vouchers. You could do Section 8 disposition. I want to sell them outright to the highest bidder, and I'll use those proceeds for X. There's some limitations there, but much broader than public housing. You could say, you know what, I'm going to transfer my assets and my programs to a neighboring housing authority that's willing to take them. Could you find a neighboring housing authority willing to take over ownership and manage your 21 units? Yeah. Can you find a neighboring housing authority willing to take over your rural housing program with the current 9% mortgage?
Yeah.
Probably a pretty difficult sale,
Right.
selling job. So that problem. Now you might be able to go to rural housing and say, look, I'm getting out of the business. I can't make it work. I don't know. You'd have to talk to rural housing about that. But so you've got a variety of options there. The pros are for Section 18. So to me, between RAD and Section 18, it sounds like Section 18 would disposition and project-based vouchers be more lucrative. The tenants would have much more opportunity. Certainly, it would be more financially affordable to them because they would get the air conditioning utility allowance. And they'd have that mobility option at the end of a year to move if they wanted to. Cons, so if, right now, we give you your money and we require all these things, just like capital funds. I say, I'm going to make you spend it on capital needs. If you become a private landlord, you're nonprofit, it's up to you to make sure you're putting aside some funds to take care of capital. There's no more capital fund, right? There's no more operating fund. You have the ability to succeed or fail with much less oversight. Mm-hmm. So you'd have to make sure that now we got to operate. It's not HUD here saying, no, you can't do that. It's ourselves saying, no, we can't spend that money. We need to be saving the money to take care of this capital needs. So you'd have ability to succeed or fail with less oversight. If I'm you, I see that as a pro, but some people would see it as a con. There's a little bit of that safety net that disappears because there's not HUD looking over your shoulder, make sure you're not making mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You are the pros. Now I'm a landlord. I don't have to do all the stuff I have to do for public housing. That's a really big one in my mind. Mm-hmm. If I had that choice, it would be very attractive to me to just, I think I can manage property. I can find lots of people who know how to manage property. I can't find a lot of people who know all this public housing requirement stuff. Mm-hmm. And that costs me a lot of money to get somebody who knows how to do that stuff. Anyway, so that you got some choices. I know you're going to think of 5 questions as soon as we quit talking.
Sure.
I've got
Yeah.
one. Can we use our current funds to pay for the fees to create a nonprofit?
Your current public housing funds can be used for public housing only. Creating a nonprofit is not public housing, so no. But I don't think there's a lot of cost. There's
It would be too much.
there's some work.
Or we just pay LegalZoom or somebody like that to put it together. We could do that. And I'm sure between among the commissioners, we could probably.
I mean, the nonprofit that would acquire these units is going to gain financially down the road. There'd be some upfront cash that'd have to be potentially laid out, but but you'd be getting properties free of debt with reasonable income potential. So it'd be lucrative for the nonprofit entity getting the units.
Okay, great. I don't think I
Thank
have.
you.
Thank you very much
You're welcome.
for
Sure.
coming
Appreciate it.
and presenting. It was very informative and definitely answers a lot of initial questions I know for myself. And we will be discussing this with the rest of the commission as well.
So there's a little bit of devil in the details and all these things, but manageable. And so without getting into all of that, just kind of high level, hopefully this gives you enough to kind of become more curious, ask us questions, give me a call anytime, and we'll talk through it further. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.